It's a Thunder and Lightning extra here on the podcast feed today. Obviously, it's Rumblings Day, so no time for real sports talk. So let's do some of that here with Emilee Smarr. She covers the Crimson Tide for the Tuscaloosa News, covers specifically basketball. It's crazy to think about that, Emily, because I'm an old man and like 10, 15 years ago, there would have been no use for your position. Alabama fans could not have cared less about basketball, but now it's a huge thing. Nate Oates has that program really going in the right direction, and they have been a thorn in the side of Mississippi State since he's been there. Chris Jans is 0-5 against Nate Oates. What is it? I mean, the easy answer is they have great players. But
Mhm.
what's the more complicated answer of why Alabama has been such a tough matchup for Mississippi State, a state team that's beaten, Tennessee, Auburn, other teams in that time frame, but can't beat Alabama?
Again, I think that this is really just the system that we see with Nate Oates, that time and time again, it's the formula that other teams can't really beat. I mean, the closest that I think personally, I think that we've seen a team come close to, obviously other than the losses that they have taken, but the closest that we saw a team come to was Kentucky. And Kentucky, Mark Pope is basically running the same Nate Oates offense over there. So I think that what we've seen over and over again this season, obviously the talent of the players is a big part of it and that NBA athleticism, but it's the number of players that Oates has coming off of the bench that I really think it has killed other teams, not just this season, but in seasons past. But this season especially. But this season or this week it could be a little bit different though, because you do have some injuries for the team. LeBaron Vylon, he's dealing with a little bit of a tweak in his ankle, obviously still available. But Darion Reed, five-star freshman, just missed his fourth game straight for the Crimson Tide. And obviously previously team's best three-point shooter, Latrell Wrightsell, out for the season with the Achilles tendon injury. So they're working a little bit short staff, but Oates has got some guys lined up.
So when you this Alabama team, it's not the same as it was a season ago. They
Mhm.
play a little different. Obviously not having Brandon Miller is a huge piece of that. But what's the main difference between this year's version of the Crimson Tide and last year's?
I think that this year's team is so selfless, and I know that that sounds like it's not a big key stat or anything like that, but when you have as much talent as this Alabama team has, there has to be this selflessness, and the team calls it Modita. It's something that they took away from the softball team. But just being able to be happy for your teammates whenever they're succeeding, whenever they're getting minutes, um, and I think that that's actually a huge part of it. Somebody who we could shout out, Muhammad Diabate, his rise for the Crimson Tide. It's his sophomore year in Tuscaloosa. He came off the bench last year. He's only come off the bench this year, but I mean, the physicality that he brings, he's just a real energizer bunny for this team. And he's definitely somebody that teams need to look out for whenever he comes off the bench. Same goes for Mississippi State on Wednesday.
Well, Diabate last year against Mississippi State had his, I think, a career high against the Bulldogs, so they'll certainly be aware. And you mentioned physicality. That's how State likes to play. They want to play physical. So
Right.
Diabate could play a big role. We'll get back to that in just a second. Obviously, with Alabama right now, the big story is with Mark Sears getting benched on Saturday night at LSU. There were some comments on social media from some members of his family. You did some reporting on this. What exactly is it simple as he wasn't playing well and they put him on the bench, or is there something deeper to that?
That was what Oates's explanation was. He said, and he didn't even really say that Mark wasn't playing well. He just said we played the guys who we felt gave us the best chance. Um, and I mean, when you have as many options as Oates does, that's something that you can do. But I think that the big difference that we saw because I mean, this isn't the first night, or LSU wasn't the first night that Mark had a scoreless performance this season. It happened against Illinois too. But I think that the big difference was Mark chose to take himself out of Illinois. He said, these guys are having a really good game. Go on ahead. The difference here is Alabama's going into the locker room tied at the half. He's the All American. He's coming off of 3 plus point games. There is that sense of helplessness, right? And I can't help but understand his mom, Lamika Sears' frustration from being in the stands when you see your child going through that. But at the same time, though, you have to keep in mind this is a 23-year-old man versus the 18 and 17-year-olds that they have on this team. Oates expects a level of veteranship and maturity out of that. And I think that, rightfully, I think that all parties had fair reactions to not to sound like a politician, but I think that all parties had fair reactions to what went down. But yeah, Oates, I mean, he did talk about it a little bit more on Hey Coach last night, but again, it really did come down to wanting to see a little bit more maturity and wanting to see a little bit more of that selflessness and just like wanting to push guys to be harder. I think that earlier in the season when Mark was having more of a slump, maybe Oates was a little bit more reluctant to go as hard as he could on him right now during SEC play, but you're coming up on Auburn. Right now, you can't cut slack.
And so that being said, how do you think Sears is going to respond Wednesday night in Starkville? It feels like there won't be a lot of middle ground. Either he'll go for 40 or the struggles will continue.
I think that's exactly what I think. Oates said that this practice or the practice that he saw from Sears on Monday was one of his best of the season. He said the same for Cliff Amore. But yeah, I definitely think it's the same. I think we're either going to see Mark Sears go for almost 30 or we're going to see him not do much. Because I mean, even then, his mom did say, he wasn't performing that bad, which any mom's going to say that. He wasn't performing that bad. He had some he was doing really well on the defensive side of the ball. And, I hate to say this, but that was kind of the same excuse that Oates was given for Mark whenever his offense was lacking earlier in the season. He's like, you know what? He's really picking it up on defense, but how much longer can you give the excuses when the regular season ends? I mean, I know we're in January, but we get into March. We're getting there.
It's kind of interesting, the matchup because you've got two guards, top players in the SEC that are struggling. Sears for Alabama, Josh Hubbard for Mississippi State has been going through a slump. Hubbard hasn't had to see the bench yet, but at the same time, he's definitely not playing as well as he's capable of playing. The game that stands out for me for Alabama is the loss to Ole Miss because it is not a very Alabama game. They couldn't do very much offensively. What did the Rebels do in that game that limited Alabama so much? And is that something Mississippi State can replicate?
Right. I think that I know that you say that Alabama didn't really look like Alabama, but if you've seen the turnovers that this team puts up every single week, Alabama was classic Alabama, especially against Ole Miss. It was a season high 21 turnovers. You can't win a basketball game like that.
Right.
So I have that same fear for Alabama coming into Starkville because this is a team that's, correct me if I'm wrong, but third in the league in forcing turnovers.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean, they're forcing opponents to 14 turnovers per game. Alabama's coming in averaging 12.9 per game. And I think that the big thing that could kill Alabama here is the points off of turnovers that Mississippi State is averaging compared to the Crimson Tide. Crimson Tide's, let me see, I have it right here. Opponents are scoring 12.3 or 12.3 turnover points on Alabama at this point, but that is not going to be the case for Mississippi State, who's like nearly at 22 points per game on turnover points. Yeah.
State does a good job of forcing turnovers, but they've been a little careless with the ball themselves these past couple of games. So probably right. Whoever wins that battle is probably going to win this game if you had to guess.
Right. And I mean, Alabama can force turnovers themselves. They're forcing about 10 per game right now. But I mean, by those metrics, State could give up the ball the way that it's been and still come away with a win.
So people who listen to this podcast know that when we do game previews and stuff, we always like to predict an X factor, a guy that I don't want to hear Mark Sears. I don't want to hear Grant Nelson. Who's somebody else on that Alabama team that you could see in this matchup having a big game and being the difference for Alabama?
I really think that Aiden Holloway could be the difference for Alabama. Obviously shooting over 50% from the 3-point line in SEC play, but this is a Mississippi State team that's given up over 34% of shots from the 3-point line. So if 3-pointers can fall for Alabama, although it has been a struggle all season, they're only shooting 32.1% beyond the arc. But I think that if Aiden Holloway can have himself a night and he takes threes whenever he sees them, which will be much to Oates' liking, I think that Alabama could find a weak spot where they could really key in on, or as you like to say, X factor, that they could key in on Mississippi State.
We shall see. Big game, 8:00 tip at the Humphrey Coliseum on Wednesday. Emilee Smarr, thanks so much for joining us. We appreciate you.
Thanks for having me.